Hello my dear friends, you're on the Military Summary channel, and today we will discuss the situation in Ukraine the 14th of May of 2023. Today we have a lot of very interesting updates, so let's start. As we discussed in my previous video, the Russians launched another massive missile attack on the western part of Ukraine, and as a result of those attacks, another warehouses and ammo depots were destroyed in this area. And the Ukrainian sources published a lot of video and photo confirmations, and today the main target, the main city the Russians were attacking was Ternopil, the town that located on the western part of Ukraine and on the east of Lvov, in the east of Ukraine-Poland border. So this is the video of explosion. As you can see, the Russians managed to get another ammo depot in this area. Furthermore, the Russian sources are saying that that was the ammo depot of the missiles for HIMARS system. So as you can see, this is a very painful loss for the Ukrainians right before the beginning of the counter-offensive operation on the south. I believe that the Western countries are able to produce and supply more, but at this moment, at these seconds, when the Ukrainians are planning to start, this is very painful. Very interesting updates are coming from Bakhmut, from the heart of Donbass arc operation, we could say. And there are no changes on the ground. Probably there are some changes, but for now we still haven't received any updates from the reliable Western or the Russian resources. So for now we are not updating this map. But the interesting information is that the Ministry of Defense of Russian Federation, after 3 days of fierce fightings on the flanks, provided the first numbers, the first piece of information about the situation on the flanks and about those defense operations. The Ministry of Defense reported that there were at least 3 defense operations on the flanks. The first one took place on the south, in the area between Ivanovsk and Klishevka, and the Russians are saying that the main brigade who took part in those defense operations was the 4th Separate Motorized Rifle Brigade. If you remember, we discussed the salient a few days in a row during the past days, and I told you that I'm expecting some information from this area. As I understand, the first Assault Brigade from the Ukrainian side tried to attack this area, and 80th Air Assault Brigade as well. Those brigades are located in the vicinity of Ivanovsk and Chasov Yar, and previous week, this is exactly the brigades who were attacking the Russians in this area. And the Russians are saying recently these brigades managed to capture the bridgehead on the western side of the channel, and now they were trying to capture the forest between Klishevka and Ivanovsk. And the Russians are saying that as a result of that attack, there were 3 waves of attack of like 5th Assault Brigade and 80th Assault Brigade, and the Russians are saying that as a result of those attempts, the Ukrainians lost 200 losses and 9 armored vehicles, including 3 tanks. But also the Russians are saying that as a result of those attacks, as a result of artillery fire and so on, the Russians lost 3 officers of this 4th brigade, the head of this brigade and his vice commander who replaced him during that battle. So 2 commanders were killed. But the Russians are saying that Ukrainians couldn't develop their bridgehead and were forced to step back in direction of Ivanovsk and Chasov Yar. That was the first attempt. And the thing that we need to add, that the Ukrainians weren't using the Western weapon. They were using just the Soviet types of tanks and armored vehicles, probably the light vehicles from like Kipri, like Humvee, and many other types of light vehicles from the Western countries, but those were just the first waves of attack. I expect that Ukrainians will relaunch their counter-offensive operation because they need to capture this bridgehead to release the road that connects Konstantinovka, Chasov Yar and Bakhmut. So that was the first attack on the south area. When talking about what Berkhovska water reservoir, this area and the railroad station, the Ukrainians also made few attempts to attack. And when talking about the Russian forces, the main forces who were there is 20th Motorized Brigade in this area, to be more precise, the 3rd Battalion of the 20th Motorized Brigade. And the Russians are saying that as a result of the Ukrainians were using around 100 soldiers, 7 tanks, and 14 armored vehicles. Imagine yourself in the air between this water reservoir and these railroad ways. There was around 100 soldiers and 7 tanks. To tell the truth, it looks like a massive suicide operation, because the Russians were located on the well-prepared positions between these two barriers, water barrier and railroad ways, and they were pretty safe, and they feel themselves, believe me, they felt themselves very nice in that situation. And the Russians are saying that as a result of attack of this, I believe, 76th Mechanized Brigade, or probably the 92nd Mechanized Brigade, the Ukrainians lost 50% of the forces that took part in those attacks, and also around 18 armored vehicles, including 7 tanks. So it's also like almost they lost every single tank that were used in that attack, and more than half of armored vehicles. So the losses is significant, and that was a real suicide operation. But one more time, that was just the first wave, because the Ukrainians, this case, were using also old Soviet types of weapon. Of course, they are completely modernized, and that was the first wave. The Russians had losses as well. The Ministry of Defense haven't provided any losses of the Russians. The Ukrainian Ministry of Defense neither have provided any numbers, so we can't understand the real losses from the Russian side. And also the Russians were saying that there was another defense operation of the flanks, and they haven't provided the real info, the real disposition of those forces. But if you remember, if you were following the previous videos, we discussed the salient between Zalesnyanska, Dubovo, Vasilievka and Orekhovo, this triangle, and we discussed that the Ukrainians will try to attack, and probably they were attacking with 56th and 57th Motorized Brigade, and the Russians are saying that the main that 6th motorized division were the forces who took part in that defense operation. But the level of that defense operation is less in comparison with two operations we discussed in the previous part of this video. And the Russians are saying that as a result of those clashes, the Ukrainians lost 3 tanks and 2 tanks and 3 armored vehicles and 30 soldiers. So it was a very slow attack with one purpose: to pin down the Russians, not allow them to be flexible and so on. So anyway, we can say that the first wave of attack was repulsed by the Russians. Later, the Russians published video confirmation of destroyed tanks in this area, because as we understand that during those attacks, the first wave, the Ukrainians lost, according to the Russians, 12 tanks. So it's a very big number of forces, as just for a few days. So the Russians published the confirmation, and that's it about the situation on the ground in the vicinity of Bakhmut. This evening we expect more updates. We expect the update from the Yegor Prigozhin, the head of Wagner's. He will give us more updates about the square meters left to capture Bakhmut. The Russians are very close to this target, and the Ukrainians are trying to slow down the Russians as much as possible. And no matter the losses, they're very, very successful. And everything is fit to the patterns we know about the Russians, about the Ukrainians. When talking about the Ukrainians, if we ask them what is more important, the bridgehead, the ground, or the manpower, the Ukrainians will always say the ground. And if you ask the Russians what is more important, manpower or the ground, the Russians will always say the manpower. So this is the difference, and this is the results, and this is the thing that took place in Bakhmut during the previous 24 hours. Now let's move to the Western sources map, and let's discuss another battles, another situation on the front lines. Very interesting updates are coming from Siversk bridgehead. The Ukrainians, the Russians, my bad, managed to accumulate significant number of forces right to the north of Siversk, but they're not starting any offensive operation in this area. Furthermore, the Russians are saying that as a result of clashes during the previous days, they managed to capture finally, as a result of fierce fightings for more than few months, they managed finally to capture this bridgehead. I'm not saying finally because it's like finally, I'm saying that they spent a lot of time to do this, and currently they are starting put pressure and movements in direction of Bilogorovka. And of course, the main goal is not to capture Siversk, but to bypass Bilogorovka and to get on these positions and to be ready to launch their attack further. What does it mean? If you remember the interview of Prigozhin, where he showed us the big map where he was drawing lines as military summary, he told us that the main goal of the main attack of the Ukrainians will be from Siversk along the railroad ways and direction of the road that connects Popasna, the main base of Wagner's, and Bakhmut, this area, this road. And the Russians have accumulated significant number of forces right behind the Siversk group. So this is exactly what the Russians expect. As soon as the Ukrainians launch their counter-offensive operation, the Russians will attack them immediately to their back and will try to stretch their forces, and they will try maybe even to encircle or to create a cauldron. We haven't heard this title for a very long time. Interesting updates are coming from Novosilovskaya, Kuzemovka, from this bridgehead. As we know, Novosilovskaya is completely under Ukrainian control as a result of fierce fightings during the previous months. They managed to penetrate the Russians and to force them to step back on the eastern side of these railroad ways. And currently some Russian sources public another information about this area, that the Russians were forced to step back from Kuzemovka to the north, to the east, and to the south. Let's say the Russians were forced to step back to the positions of the hills. So they are on the hill. So this is like the area behind on the right side of this area is the hills. And from these hills, the Russians controls Novosilovsk and Kuzemovka. Kuzemovka is not in the gray zone, but probably there are just like some small part of forces like the checkpoints and the main forces of Russia located behind Kuzemovka on the hills. And from these positions, they are able to control for 100% entire bridgehead in this area. Furthermore, if you have mentioned, according to the Ministry of Defense report of Russian Federation, there is like third or fourth day in a row where the Ukrainians have a very heavy losses in Kupiansk front line. So probably this situation is highly connected with another attempts of the Ukrainians to penetrate the Russians' defense orders exactly in Novosilovskaya, Kuzemovskaya, and to finally get on the straight line in front of Svatova. So this is a very tasty piece of cake for the Ukrainians, and they're doing all their best to achieve this and to get on this bridgehead. But for now, they still can't do this because they're stopped with the Russian forces on the hills that located on the east of Novosilovskaya. When talking about South Donetsk and Zaporozhye area, there are not many updates from this area. Just regular artillery duels, just regular artillery clashes along the front line, another destroyed ammo depots and so on, without any progress on the ground. The Russians, for example, reported about destroyed, let's say, positions of some 41st Brigade that were destroyed, few ammo depots, another Raider ANT-PQ-36 was destroyed, but without like significant movements and so on. The only interesting piece of information that we received today from the Ministry of Defense is that Ukrainians lost 120 soldiers on Zaporozhye area, and as we discussed in the past, all these losses are tightly connected with the situation that Ukrainians have already accumulated significant number of forces along the combat line. So this over-concentrating gives the Russians opportunity to attack this concentration of forces and so on. When talking about the 14th of May, the Ukrainians haven't launched even a single missile during the day, so probably they're trying to change their tactics, and probably they're trying to analyze the data they received after the missile attack with Storm Shadow against Lugansk. They're trying to maybe to schedule a little bit and to update their system, and I expect more in the next days, more attacks in this direction. And when talking about the situation on the ground, this is all interesting updates. And now one more time, let's return back to the global map, to this area. And as you know, yesterday Zelensky were flying and visited Italy, and he had meeting with the Pope, and he has meetings with the Prime Minister of Italy, Meloni. I believe that when talking about the Prime Minister of Italy, Zelensky was trying to get some guarantees and something like this, and he was asking Italy to provide him more weapon, and I believe that he got everything, or at least Zelensky got all the necessary promises for this. And when talking about the Pope, I believe that Zelensky was asking him to condemn the violence and to condemn Russia. But as we understand, and the sources are saying that the Pope refused Zelensky in his plans, and the Pope was trying to, according to the sources we have, was trying to be in the middle of this situation, and he was trying to, and the position of the Pope was to stop fire and not to continue the violence and the escalation of violence. After the visit of Italy, Zelensky moved to Germany, and he has a meeting with the president of Germany, Steinmeier, and after that he has a meeting with Olaf Scholz, and the Chancellor of Germany promised him to provide Ukraine to give him the biggest aid since the beginning of military aid since the beginning of the special military operation. I believe that Zelensky will receive also everything he wants from Germany, and sources are saying that tomorrow Zelensky is going to visit France and he's going to have meeting with Macron. For now he is still in Germany, and tomorrow, and I believe that after visiting of Italy, Germany, France, probably he will have meeting with an official London and probably in Poland as the final point of his trip in Europe, and after that the Ukrainians is going to start. And the question is whether the Russians are able to meet the Ukrainians or not. I believe we are going to see a lot of surprises, and the situation the next week is going to be intensifying and more escalative. And that's it for this video. Military Summary channel reminds to condemn any violence in Ukraine. Thank you for your watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your likes, join my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.